moving on. But like what in as a dev, especially for like some first time devs that are getting publisher agreements and such, what are some mistakes that they can potentially make, especially if it is their first time?
I think one of the most important things to do in any of these relationships is to manage expectations and constantly manage expectations. So there's always going to be uh, speed bumps. There's going to be features you thought were going to take this long and they're going to take twice as long. I mean, there's going to be something that you're not expecting is going to happen. And um, being able to communicate quickly about them, ask a lot of questions. I think that's very helpful for both publisher and developer. Ask each other questions. Think about. I mean, you help avoid some of these fires by asking the questions ahead of time. Like, are you local? Are you prepping your text for localization? I'll just bring it back to that example. Like asking that question, if they weren't, maybe now they will. So you avoid that bottleneck if you ask that question. So managing expectations and this is me speaking as a producer on both sides of the fence. It's one of the number one things, or one of the mistakes you can do is to not let people know what's going on and then bring a surprise on them.
Yeah.
Nobody likes surprises. And then the other thing I would say that I think may come as a shock to some folks the first time out is having to give up some creative control. Like that dilution of your creative control when you bring on other stakeholders like a publisher or an investor or anyone else who's now involved. Like, I think there can be a lot of frustration because maybe they didn't ask the right questions in the beginning, or they weren't managing the expectations that I talked about just before. And so now someone's coming in and making demands and saying, you need to do this thing or this other thing, and you may not want to do that. And now there's frustrations on both parties, right? Like, you want control over your game. And in some cases, though, like, that other stakeholder might have a really good reason or experience to say. Like, one example would be if you're making a free-to-play project and you're working with a publisher that's really great at monetizing these things, and they worked on a lot of free-to-play projects, they may have some ideas or some strong guidance for something they want you to do or build or put into the game to help you monetize it. It might be good to listen to them, even though you might not want to build that feature or that might not feel good to you. It's just something to keep in mind. I feel like people are not always prepared for, like, I'm not the only one in control of my project anymore. Someone else is going to be speaking into this in terms of creatives and everything else. And it's one of those factors that's important when you're considering a publishing partner is how involved do you want them to be, and being very clear about that when it comes to certain things. Like some developers really want to own their marketing materials and assets. Like, they want to create them. They feel like they know their game best and they really want to do that. And in some cases, that's fine. Other cases, like, they might be behind schedule in finishing the project. And even if it's not as good, it's better if your publisher goes off and does marketing assets, because you need your guys making the actual game and finishing it.
Right.
So there's a lot of trade-offs. But the point is, just being ready and thinking about, like, there's going to be other cooks in this kitchen, and trying to be on the same page with them and engage with them. And not get too frustrated over, there's somebody else who cares that we do this right. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, just those examples, and I think that's a really important one too, is just kind of learning how to let go and having that understanding behind it. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, which is really thinking this through and knowing like what to expect. So if you're going to decide to go with a partner or a publisher, to know that at some point you might need to relinquish some control. And everybody's doing this for the benefit of the project too. So it's not like anybody's trying to really take over or anything. They're just everybody's doing their thing in the way that they can help out the most with the project. And sometimes it can be a little bit more challenging to let go. So I always think that's a good thing to understand, and what you said were great examples of that, and ways on how to understand and kind of cope and kind of move forward from that position, because it, like you said, it can be tough for people when they get to that point and be like, wait, nah, it's my baby. I don't want to let it go or whatever. But sometimes you need to make those changes to really move forward. So totally agree with you there. All right, so I'm going to jump a bit because I know we had a little bit more to talk about in terms of communication expectations, but I think we did a pretty good job at covering that and really understanding, what those things are. So I want to jump into talking about lessons learned. So, and to give some context to our listeners today, we've been talking here and there through email and such, and through some prior conversations, you did mention something about it's good for, indie devs to watch Shark Tank. So kind of going back to what we were talking about a little bit with the pitch. But while the initial pitch is obviously different than from an episode of Shark Tank, why would you say watching a show like that is valuable to watch?
Yeah, it's a little bit goofy, but like I really like it. And now that I've participated in some of these conferences, speed dating events, like it feels like I'm on Shark Tank. So for people who don't understand, Shark Tank, in a nutshell, is a show where people come and pitch their real life products to investors. So publishers are like sharks. I mean, you're coming to pitch your project. You want to keep in mind that they want to make money. They want to use their money and resources to make more money. That's what this is ultimately all about. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with the sharks, right? So there's a weird, I don't know what the right term is, but there's adversarial and also friendly. Like, everybody wants to work together to make the most amount of money. Mm. But there is like negotiation that happens, and there's things to think about. So part of why I like the show is it condenses this long process, because when you do this with a publisher, it's going to take weeks. It's not something that happens really fast to get to a deal. And there's back and forth. It really condenses it into 10 or 15 minutes of like, this is how this goes. Mm. So it can be very helpful in that regard. And I think one of the great things about watching the show is you can watch how people come on and they make mistakes in their pitch in various ways. And the sharks will let them know how they made mistakes. And these are the same types of mistakes that an indie dev might make coming into a meeting with the publisher. So, one of those mistakes, classic on the show, is not knowing their numbers. They'll dig into some amount of numbers about cost of user acquisition or how much money it's going to take to finish the product or whatever it is, and the presenter won't have the answer, and the sharks will get all over their case for not knowing your numbers. You want to know your numbers when you sit down with a publisher, like how much it's going to take to finish this game, what's my burn rate, all of those sorts of things you want to have prepped, the numbers. There's going to be some wiggle room, like not if it's a mobile project and you've done some betas, you might even come with really fine details, like here's my retention rate, and here's at day 7, and here's my day 3 retention rate, and here's my cost of user acquisition. But you might not have all of those numbers, especially if you haven't done a beta or you haven't, or you're not doing free to play and it's just a buy to play project. But you want to have as many as you can that are available to you. So you don't want them to come off thinking like these guys don't know what it's going to cost to finish their game. You don't want to leave them feeling that way. Another thing would be really knowing the market and what place the product has in it. The sharks often ask the contestants, they ask, what's proprietary or unique about your product? Like, why are people going to buy it? And in some cases on the show, like they will have gotten a patent to protect themselves. And I'm not saying you should patent your game feature. That doesn't work in this business. But you really want to have a good answer for like why people are going to buy this game over all the competition, and like what's really great about my game. And you want to be able to be compelling about what that is. Another thing you want to do is research on the show, some of the pitchers research the sharks, and they even know which sharks they want to work with, if possible, before they come on the show. And you want to do the same thing with the publishers if you get a chance, is you want to do some research about them. You want to know, like we talked about earlier, you want to know what stage of development they focus on, what are their strengths, how are they going to help you, and then target those folks that really fit with where your team is at. Another thing to think about on that show is selling yourself. Like there's some folks who go on the show whose projects aren't the best, but the sharks fall in love with the people. Like they see the salesmanship of them, or they see the innovation, and they just want to work with them, even if they're on the fence about the product, but they really like the person. And sometimes the deal finally comes down to that. So you want to think about selling yourself and your dev team and your dev team's capabilities, even over and above sometimes like what the game it is that you're making. And that helps. We talked about this, but that will help when it comes to the speed bumps and those other things. If you need to make pivots, like making a publisher feel confident in like, oh, there's a problem with the schedule. Like these guys can figure it out, and they will know how to solve it, and they'll know how to, find the fun or whatever it is. Like they're going to get there. Right. Giving that confidence to the publisher is important. And then I think the last thing to keep in mind in watching a show like that is to sort of come into the conversation knowing what your breaking point is or your limits are. Like sharks are after a good deal for them, and at some point it might not be a good deal for you. So if you have in mind, like don't go crazy with your valuation, because maybe you won't get a deal, because maybe you're not in the right headspace. But definitely know the breaking point so that you don't come away with sign a contract and then feel like, man, I just gave up too much of this. I really didn't want to do that. It can be very challenging, I know, especially people who are in a tough spot in terms of the finances or whatever. Right. But you really want to know what those limits are before the conversation, so you don't feel pressured into going too far.
Yeah, and that's why I think I really like that example, because everything that you just explained there basically is very similar to the process that happens, but the big difference being it's a much more condensed version. But all those things that are happening are basically the same types of things when you're like negotiating with publishers, similar types of conversations, things like knowing your numbers, really knowing your product, and then having passion. And I want to kind of emphasize that a little bit, because I think that's an important part. And I know prior to the show, we talked a little bit about this, but like how important is it when it comes down to passion too? Because I mean, sometimes I think that can almost stand out. It can't just stand out on its own clearly, but it's still an important factor. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit?
Sure. Like, I mean, if you're really passionate and you know, that means you kind of know your space, you know your game, you know why it's going to work. That passion breeds confidence in, what you're ultimately going to accomplish together. And it lets them know that, like, and this actually does well on the show. The folks who come on that are just like, hell or high water, like, I'm going to make this happen. Like, if I don't get a deal here, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm still going door to door. I'm still going to conventions. I'm still selling. Like, I am that into it. Right. They love those people. The only time it's not good is if they're super passionate about something that is doomed to fail and there's no way to make it successful.
And then maybe just don't have a proper realization of that. Too, like the passion turns into tunnel vision, for example.
Exactly. But barring that situation, like, that passion can do nothing but really help you, sell yourself, sell the product, do the whole thing. Another thing I just thought of that's also important and interesting on the show is that there's a lot of creative ways to do deals. So when you're thinking about like what your limits are, and if you're like, these are non-negotiables, but there's a lot of creative ways to do other aspects of your deal. So be prepared to think that way. So don't just think, oh, it's equity or it's dollars or it's nothing. Like, there's there's ways that you can say, I would like some marketing guarantee, or like you can do sliding scales where it's this much rev share until this many copies, and then this much rev share until this many copies. Like there's a lot of different ways to get to the end goal for both publisher and developer. So if you're willing to think